on our Facebook page today and recording it for posterity because Norvin didn't mind. And I would just like to very briefly introduce to you all Norvin Richards, who really needs no introduction, but I want to do it anyway. I won't go into the whole history of how we met back at Cornell in the day when Norvin was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student. But I will fast forward to today, where Norvin is professor of linguistics at MIT and specializing in syntax and syntax phonology interface, we're going to hear about today. And the author of many works. I will just mention 3 books that I know about. I may have missed some. One is 2001 Movement in Language, and 2010 Uttering Trees, which has to be my favorite name of a linguistics book ever, Norvin. I just love it. Uttering Trees.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And 2016 Contiguity Theory, which was at a certain point the title of this talk, but it has changed. And now the title of today's talk is Replacing Syntactic Parameters with Phonological Ones. And we're delighted to have you, Norvin. Thanks for doing this. Welcome. You can unmute and do this, whatever kind of welcome you all want to do. It's great to see you. We usually try to go for, I don't know, the usual 45 plus 15 for question discussion. I won't, unless you want me to, I won't, enforce that, unless you want me to give you a warning at a certain point.
Well, yeah, if you could, no, you don't need to do that. I'll keep an eye on the clock. Yeah.
Okay, good. So in that case, please welcome Norvin Richards. Take it away, Norvin.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, John, for that gracious introduction and for inviting me to be here. It's an honor to have a chance to speak to everybody. I'm going to attempt to share something on my screen, and I'm getting a warning. Starting share screen will stop other computers' sound share. Is that a bad thing? Okay, just continue.
That was the music. That was the music.
Oh, that was the music. Okay, so everybody enjoy John's music for the last couple of seconds, and I'm going to show you.
No, it's over. It's over.
I'm going to show you my handout here. Okay, so as John mentioned, I'm a syntactician, and one of the big results of syntax, those of you who've been studying syntax either here or elsewhere in your lives, you know that one of the things we think in syntax, at least many types of syntax, is that there is such a thing as movement. That is, that it's useful to think of languages as putting things, words, phrases, things like that, in particular positions and then moving them around. And we think that there are parameters, that it's useful to think of the world as containing parameters that tell you whether a given language has a particular type of overt movement or not. So we say things like English has overt WH movement in questions like 1a, and Korean, for example, doesn't. It leaves WH phrases in situ. Lots of interesting literature on what exactly the difference between these things is. Does Korean have some sneaky covert version of what English is doing overtly? Not going to address any of those questions today, but 1a versus 1b is standardly taken to be a parameter that distinguishes English from Korean. English is an overt WH movement language. Korean is a WH in situ language. And there are lots of parameters like these. Another one that I'll just mention briefly, French is often taken to be a language in which the verb raises into T. That's an account of the ordering of the verb with respect to certain kinds of adverbs, facts like that are famously been the subject of a lot of research, going back at least to Pollock's classic work. And English, on the other hand, is a language in which the verb does not do that. And if you ask standard issue minimalism, why does, for example, English have overt WH movement and Korean not have overt WH movement? Standard issue minimalism gives you answers like, well, that's because the WH feature in English is strong and the WH feature in Korean is weak. Or that's because the WH feature in English is associated with an EPP property and the WH feature in Korean isn't, or things like that. In other words, standard issue minimalism is telling you, you know, the WH feature in English is painted green and the WH feature in Korean is painted red. Or to put it yet another way, standard issue minimalism is telling you, don't ask me why English has overt WH movement and Korean doesn't. They just do, okay? That's just a parameter that distinguishes those languages. It doesn't follow from anything else. If you want to learn how to speak Korean, one of the things you must do is to leave your WH phrases in situ. And if you want to learn how to speak English, you must learn to move them. Asking why the English WH phrase moves and the Korean WH phrase doesn't is like asking why the Korean word for who ends in something that's written here with the letter U and the English one doesn't. It's just a fact. You've got to learn things like this. And just so we're clear, that could be right. It could be that these are just parameters that you must learn. That is at least the standard approach. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes and change trying to convince you that it's not right, that actually there are things that we can say about whether a language moves its WH phrases or doesn't, whether a language leaves its verb in the verb phrase like English or moves it up into T the way French does, that we can have a predictive theory of whether a language, which of these things a language does. The theory is called contiguity theory. And it's an attempt to actually explain these kinds of cross-linguistic differences rather than just stipulating them. The central idea, the core idea, is that syntax cares more about phonology than we are used to believing. We're used to believing that the syntax operates in a realm where there is no phonology, creates a syntactic structure in complete ignorance of the interface with phonology, and then hands that syntactic structure to phonology, which messes it up in various ways. So phonology has its own interests and concerns and doesn't care maybe so much about syntax. So it converts that syntactic structure into ultimately a set of instructions for the articulators, for the vocal tract or for the hands if you're signing. The proposal that I'm going to make here is that that's not quite right. It's close, but it's not quite right. Syntax does have a certain kind of limited access to phonological information. In particular, the idea is that you begin building prosodic structure earlier than we are used to thinking of. That happens during the narrow syntax. And the narrow syntax can perform operations that are intended to improve the phonological representation. So it can perform operations that are driven by phonological requirements. Contiguity theory posits two main conditions. I'm going to talk about one of them today. The one I'm not going to talk about is called affix support. I have it in parentheses here, and we can go back and talk about it if anybody is curious about it. It's a version of the EPP, which differs from the EPP in that it allows you to predict whether a language will have the EPP or not, based on facts about where the stress goes in the verb. But I'm not going to talk about that today. The thing that I'm going to talk to you about today has a starting fact. So let me show you the starting fact. In a noun phrase that contains an adjective and a noun, some languages will have the highest pitch on the adjective and others on the noun. Let me show you some pitch tracks. Here's a Norwegian pitch track for a noun phrase that means an old puzzle. And you can see that it's higher on old than it is on puzzle. Yeah, the highest point in old is comparatively high. The highest point in puzzle is lower. Yeah. Here in 3, on the other hand, is a pitch track for an Icelandic noun phrase that means an awful secret. And you can see that awful, has its highest point around here, and that secret has its highest point somewhere in here, slightly higher. Yeah. So in Norwegian, the highest point is on the first word. In Icelandic, it's on the second word. That's a parameter. And it's a parameter that I'm going to make use of to distinguish languages. In the end, that difference between Norwegian and Icelandic is going to have lots of consequences, which we'll have a look at. I'm realizing that another thing that I would like to do is to keep the chat window somewhere where I can see it. Okay, I have the chat window now somewhere where I can see it. So if in the middle of this talk, somebody thinks of something terrible that I should say, you have a sudden question that you want to make sure that I address, feel free to type things in the chat and I will keep half an eye on the chat window as I go through this stuff. What I'm going to be talking about today is prosodic prominence, and I'm going to claim that prosodic prominence, we start calculating that in the narrow syntax, and that the syntax performs operations that are driven by the need to put prosodic prominence in certain places and not others. So I'm going to define what I mean by prosodic prominence, and then I'm going to argue that some syntactic operations are driven by a need to put prosodic prominence in the right places. The engine of the explanation is this notion, what's called probe goal contiguity. And it goes like this. If you have a probe P and a goal G, you can't have anything between P and G which is more prosodically prominent than G. G, remember, is the goal. Yeah. So if you have P and G, in whichever order they're in, there can't be anything between them that's more prosodically prominent than the goal. Yeah. As I said, I'm going to tell you how you find out what's more prosodically prominent than what, but that's going to be the engine of the explanation for a variety of syntactic facts. Long tradition of syntacticians talking about prosodic prominence and talking about where main sentential stress goes. And this is going to sort of fit into that long tradition. Okay, what do I mean by prosodic prominent? Here's a first draft of an answer. First, let's say that a string contains a maximal projection. If every terminal dominated by that maximal projection is in the string, we'll say, first of all, we're only going to calculate prominence statements, that is, statements of relative prominence, for pairs of elements that are not in a dominance relation. So we'll talk about, say, phrases or heads that are not in dominance relations with each other. If you're looking at the relation between a head and a phrase, the phrase is more prominent than the head. So phrases are always more prominent than heads. And then 5C, there is a parameter. If you have a bunch of phrases in a string and you're trying to figure out where the most prominent one is, languages vary. There are languages that realize more prominence on the leftmost, and there are languages that realize more prominence on the rightmost. And that's the parameter that I illustrated for you in the pitch tracks that I just showed you. So Norwegian is a left prominent language. It puts more, it has this higher pitch on the word on the left. Icelandic is a right prominent language. It has its higher pitch in the word on the right. So here's the roadmap for where we're gonna go from here. I'm gonna show you two tests for how you find out for a given language what its value is for the parameter in 5C, whether it's a left prominent language or a right prominent language. And then I'm going to show you what that parameter, together with this general condition of probe goal contiguity, can do for us. So first, we're going to run through some tests. The first test has to do with downstep, so it has to do with pitch. And in order to run this test, we need to start by drawing a distinction, the classic distinction in the prosodic literature, between what's called downstep and what's called declination. And it's easiest to illustrate this with a pitch track. In 6, I have a pitch track for you from Mongolian. This is a Mongolian sentence containing 3 branching noun phrases, 3 noun phrases that consist of an adjective and a noun. It means the artistic knight gave a gentle cow to the spacey student. It's a perfectly normal, ordinary Mongolian sentence. Mongolians say this kind of thing to each other all the time. And if I have boxes around the DPs in this sentence. One of the things you can see in these boxes is that every word, every adjective, and every noun ends in a low-high sequence on the last 2 syllables. And then if you look at these pitch peaks, there are 2 kinds of relationships between the pitch peaks that I want you to think about. One of them is a relationship that holds across the boxes from one box to the other. And this is what's called declination. So if you look at you can see the first pitch is fairly high in each of these DPs in each of these boxes. And you can see that the first box has the highest pitch. And then the pitches sort of gradually get lower as you speak. That's what's called declination. There's kind of a general trend in sentences for the pitch of your voice to go down. So we're going to have to kind of correct for that. That's a possible universal. It's possible that all languages have this general tendency for the pitch of your voice to tend to generally descend. So, there's this little tune that each of these boxes play, and they are playing it in slightly lower keys as you go along. The other relationship between pitch peaks that I want you to think about in these boxes has to do with the relationship between the first and the second peak, right? So each of them has 2 peaks in it. It has one very high first peak and then one much lower second peak. Right? So the tune ends up going something like da 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 da. Yeah, so there's a particular tune for a DP, and that tune, as I said, goes down in pitch as you speak. So, okay. I'm watching the chat just in case anybody wants me to stop. Does anybody want to stare at this pitch track a little bit further? So two things, declination and downstep. Declination, general tendency for the pitch of your voice to fall as you speak. Downstep, this relationship within HDP, the second peak is smaller than the first to a greater degree than declination by itself will explain. And notice that as you go from one box to the next, the pitch goes back up again. Not as high as the first pitch in the preceding box, but high. Okay, so declination, I think I said, may be universal. It may be that all languages have this general tendency for the pitch of your voice to fall as you speak, but downstep is not. So here's the experiment that's going to give us our first test for determining whether a language is left prominent or right prominent. If you have a noun phrase that consists of an adjective and a noun, a given language is either going to give a pitch boost to the word on the left or to the word on the right. Thanks to declination, the result of that is lopsided. So if you're a left prominent language, you have a much higher first word than a second word. That's downstep. Right prominent languages have pitch peaks of more or less the same height. So, you can think about it via the abstract graphs there in 7. So thanks to declination, the first word is going to tend to be higher than the second. If you're left prominent, the first peak is going to be way higher than the second. If you're right prominent, then the second one is going to be maybe about the same height as the first or possibly slightly higher. Yeah. So experiment. This involves recording speakers of various languages saying 10 sentences with branching indefinite subjects and objects, sentences like the one in 8. In this novel, a foolish student awakens an evil demon while camping in the woods. So I did this with 11 different languages, small numbers of speakers for some of them. I actually did it for 12 because I have also run this test for German. I'm going to ruthlessly suppress the results until we get to German later on. German we will have to talk about. So 11 languages there we ran this experiment on. Turns out there are two kinds of languages. There are languages like English, Korean, and Norwegian, where if you look at the pitch peaks associated with the stressed syllables of the adjectives and the noun, the first pitch peak, which is on the adjective in all three of these languages, is generally higher than the second pitch peak, the one on the noun. So you get English pitch tracks like the one in 9, an open doorway. Yeah, higher, lower. And there's a Korean example in 10 that means a huge carrot. And here's a Norwegian example for a Norwegian phrase that means an old puzzle. Yeah. So higher on the first word and lower on the second word. That's one type of pitch track that you get in these languages. Pitch peak associated with stressed syllable, that sometimes requires some analysis. So all of these Norwegian examples have pitch peaks on their first syllable. Those first syllables are stressed. Some of them also have a high tone at the end of the noun phrase. If you know anything about Norwegian, you know this is a lexical difference between different kinds of nouns. Some of them have 2 high pitch targets in them. So here's a hungry farmer. You can see you've got, high on hungry, lower at the beginning of farmer, but then farmer goes, way up into the stratosphere at the end here. It goes really high. I had to throw those data out. So it's important not to include examples where words seem to have multiple pitch targets in them. So this strategy that I'm showing you only works if there's only one high pitch in each word. It works for those, but there's apparently, when there's more than one high pitch in a word, there's apparently some interaction between them such that both of them are higher than they would be ordinarily in that language. So I had to throw out Norwegian data like the one in the pitch track that I'm now mostly concealing from you, meaning a hungry farmer. So if you do that, you get the average pitch ratios in 13. For Korean, English, and Norwegian, it's around 1.2. That is, the first peak is about 1.2 times as high as the second peak. That's one type of language. Then there's another type of language, the French, Portuguese, Italian, Icelandic, Bulgarian, Russian, Basque, and Zulu kind of language. Yes, so the remaining languages in this group that I studied, those languages don't have a big dip between the first and second words of the noun phrase. Those two are generally the same height, or sometimes the second word is higher than the first. In 14, we have a Russian phrase, a clever lawyer, umny advokat, where the pitch peak is higher on advokat than it is on umly. In 15, I think I showed you Icelandic again. So here's an awful secret. So you can see higher on the second word than it is on the first. So for these languages, we get the average ratios in 16, average ratios that hover around 1 or sometimes less than 1. You can see Russian is on the very far end of this. Yeah, so it's 0.87. I'll say more about that later. Yeah. So two kinds of languages. There's the English and Norwegian and Korean kind, in which there's a lot of downstep between the first word and the second. And then there's the French, Italian, Portuguese, Bulgarian, Russian, Icelandic, Basque, and Zulu kind, in which there isn't. So two kinds of languages. Those are going to be the left prominent languages and the right prominent languages. That's shown to you there in 17. Those are the numbers. In 18, you have the same numbers as a graph. And I'm encouraging you to think of this as two different kinds of languages by giving you some gray bars and black bars. Yeah, so two different kinds of languages. The languages with the large gray bars that are around 1.2, and the languages with the lower black bars that are, around 1 or less than 1. Okay. Now, I have tried to use R to verify that the difference between these two languages is statistically significant. And I have to say try. I only have a cargo cult understanding of R, but I'm deeply thankful to Adam Albright for sort of holding my hand and helping me figure out how to do what I'm about to show you. So I used the model in 19, which involves asking R to predict the ratio between the pitch peaks of the first and second content words, using as fixed effects the position, that is whether the noun phrase is a subject or an object, and the language. And there's much more to say about that, with random slopes by position and speaker. So what I'm doing here is telling R to divide languages into the tree in 20, where the tree in 20 is determined by the average ratios between the pitch peaks that we got as the results of the experiment. So Russian, you can see, is down here at the bottom of the tree. Zulu is the language on of the right prominent languages. It's the language with the largest ratio between the peaks. It's a little bit more than 1. And we did something similar for Korean, English, and Norwegian. In effect, what I'm doing is asking R, am I justified in thinking of these as two different groups of languages? And within, for example, the right prominent languages, am I justified in thinking of Zulu as belonging in this group? Or is there a significant difference between Zulu and the rest of these languages, right? Or between Basque and the languages that are in its sister in the tree? That's what this is doing. It's an attempt to find out, first, am I right to posit this large group? And are Norwegian and Basque on the same pitch level? No, Norwegian belongs in language 2. It has around 1.2. Basque belongs within language 4, within the right prominent languages. It's around 1. Its pitch ratio is around 1. Yeah. Good question. So, okay, so is it clear what I'm attempting to do here? I'm attempting to find out first, is it right to say there are two groups of languages? And second, am I, by putting these two languages in these large groups, am I steamrollering differences, small differences between languages in the groups? So is it really true that Zulu belongs on the right, or that Korean, for example, belongs on the left? So we're studying that. Here's the result we got in 21. I've given this handout to John, and I bet John will share it with anybody who wants it. So if anybody wants to have a closer look at these data, they're here. But one of the things you can see, for example, is that position 1, that is there a difference between subjects and objects that's general across the languages? The answer is no. P is around 0.5. It's just kind of random. But there is a very statistically significant difference, language 1, that is between the left prominent languages and the right prominent languages. Yeah. So that's a very statistically significant difference. There is also a difference, for example, in language 10, position 1, which has to do with the fact about Russian that I flagged as we were going through, that Russian has a very small ratio. And that is because Russian subjects are very different from Russian objects. Russian subjects have a very high pitch peak on the second word. And I assume that there is something information structural going on. And someone who knows more about Russian information structure will have to try to study that. Someone who knows more about that than me, which is many people, many of them probably in this virtual room. So R is being, encouraging. There is a statistically significant difference between the left prominent languages and the right prominent languages. So we'll say English, Norwegian, and Korean, those are left prominent languages, and all the rest of those languages, those are right prominent languages. And I'm going to make the simplifying assumption that once you know where prominence goes in a DP, you know everything. You don't need to know anything else. So we hope that that's true. With that result in mind, we can go look at cases of downstep in other languages. So I haven't run this test, for example, on Japanese, but there's a big literature on downstep between adjectives and nouns in Japanese. So I hope Japanese is also a left prominent language. Here's a Japanese pitch track for tasty drink. Here's the Mongolian pitch track I showed you before. Sure looks like a left prominent language. Have to run the tests to be sure, but that's what it looks like. Same deal for Irish here in 24. Here's an Irish sentence that means a handsome librarian will sell beautiful flowers. It's from Emily Elfner's dissertation. You can see a big pitch peak on librarian, much higher than handsome, so it looks left prominent. Georgian, here's a Georgian pitch track in 25. Manana dropped a very big sour cherry. You can see that this branching noun phrase looks like it has a higher pitch peak at the end than it does at the beginning. So we hope that Georgian is a right prominent language. So we have this list of left prominent languages, and right prominent languages have to run the tests with more speakers, have to run them with more languages, but this is what it looks like for right now. I have started doing another kind of test. In this test, what we do is measure the length of stressed vowels. So we're looking at sentences like, at the big fencing tournament in Ottawa, she used a Canadian saber for the first time. So we're using same vowels, open syllables, and the vowels are followed by the same kind of consonant. So they're either both voiced or voiceless stops. And we're measuring the length of the vowels. And taking the average ratio of the length of the first vowel to the length of the second vowel. So far, I've only done this with these 5 languages, English, German, Portuguese, Russian, and Italian. And again, there is a basic split between German and English in which those vowels are roughly the same length. So the first vowel and the second vowel are about the same on the one hand, and Russian, Portuguese, and Italian on the other, in which you can see the ratio is around 0.8, 0.9. Yeah, so it's less than 1. That's what we're seeing here in this graph. So those are languages in which the second vowel is longer than the first vowel. Those are also languages, Russian, Portuguese, and Italian, in which the pitch experiment that I did before makes me want them to be right prominent languages. So I'm hoping that this will be another test for the position of prominence. English, of course, is a left prominent language, and I'm hoping that this will convince us that German is also a left prominent language. Did the same kind of thing with R and got the same kind of result. There's a very statistically significant difference between the 2 groups of languages. Recall when I was talking about the pitch experiment, I showed you Norwegian, and I said Norwegian often has too many tones on words, and I have to throw out a bunch of data. Yeah, so farmer in the pitch track in 32 has 2 high pitches on it, and the system that I was showing you doesn't make the right cuts if we include those data. So I ended up throwing out data like those. When I ran this experiment for German, I had to throw out almost all of the data. Germans have too many high tones in their adjectives and their nouns. So there's a German pitch track in 33 for a noun phrase that means a pregnant vampire. And you can see there's a big pitch track at the beginning of this long word for vampire. And then there's also a high pitch peak towards the end. And that means that I can't use these data. That's one reason I ran. That is the reason I started running this length study. I'm hoping that length will be a way to study languages like German that have too many high pitches in them. Another possibility would be to come up with some way to stop Germans from using these extra high tones, but I don't know how to do that. Okay, so what have we learned in this section? There may be a length test for prosodic activity in addition to the pitch test. German may also be left prominent. German pitch is complicated. We might be able to add German to our list of left prominent languages. So far, the tests are in agreement with each other as to which type of language a given language is. Okay, so how does all this help us? So one way of summarizing core claim of Richards 2016 would be to say, if you have a probe and a goal, there can't be anything between the probe and the goal that's more prosodically prominent than the goal. How do you find out whether something is more prosodically prominent than the goal? So again, the way you determine prosodic prominence goes like this. You calculate relative prosodic prominence for pairs of things that are not in a dominance relation. If you're looking at a head and a phrase, the phrase is more prominent than the head. But if you're looking at multiple phrases, you have to run these experiments. So you find out whether your language is a left prominent language or a right prominent language. And if you run the experiments, you find out the answer to that, and then that tells you. Yeah. So what does this mean? It means, first of all, that if a probe and a goal are linearly adjacent in either order, or in fact, if they have something between them, but it's not a phrase, it's just a head, this condition of probe-goal contiguity is going to be satisfied, right? Because no matter whether you're looking at a left prominent language or a right prominent language, if the goal is right next to the probe, whether the goal precedes the probe or the probe precedes the goal, in the minimal string that contains the probe and the goal is the only phrase, and so it's the most prominent thing. That's what 35b says. 35c tells you that if they're further apart than that, then you have to find out whether you're looking at a left prominent or a right prominent language. So in particular, we consider 37. Let's consider first cases where the goal follows the probe. If you've got a goal following a probe and there are phrases between them, XPs between them, then you need to know, am I looking at a right prominent language or a left prominent language? If you're looking at a right prominent language, then 37a is fine, because although there are two phrases in the string containing the probe and the goal is the rightmost thing, and it's a right prominent language, and so that's okay. The goal will be more prominent than the XP. On the other hand, if you're looking at a left prominent language, this kind of string, 37b, will not be okay, because there are two phrases in the smallest string containing the probe and the goal, and the XP is the leftmost one, and so the XP will be more prominent than the goal, and so contiguity is not satisfied. Yeah. That's for the case where the probe precedes the goal. We can do the same thing for the case where the goal precedes the probe. That's 37c and 37d. If you have a goal that's preceding a probe and it's a right prominent language, well, there can't be a phrase between them. Yeah, that's 37b backwards. Yeah. And 37d is 37a backwards. If you have a goal that's preceding a probe and it's a left prominent language, then there can be phrases in between them that can be arbitrarily distant. Yeah. That's, in the abstract, what probe-goal contiguity, the consequence of probe-goal contiguity. Invite everybody to take screenshots of this so that you can pay attention to it as we go through from now on. Yeah. Okay, so the upshot of all this is sometimes the probe and the goal need to be made adjacent. If the goal is after the probe and it's a left prominent language, that's 37b, you need to make them adjacent. The XP will intervene between them if it's a left prominent language. Or if the goal is before the probe and it's a right prominent language, then they need to be adjacent. They can't have an XP in between them. That XP will be the most prominent thing. But if the goal is already prominent where it is, then it ought to be able to stay where it is. Okay, so let's consider what this does for us. Consider first two kinds of head final languages. So Japanese and Georgian. Japanese, it's a left prominent language. We saw a pitch track that seemed to suggest that. And so that ought to mean that a probe at the end of the sentence ought to be able to be related to a goal to its left over an arbitrary distance. Japanese is left prominent. So even in 38a, where there's a phrase between the probe and the goal, it's okay, who can be more prominent than Brett? And so 38a is fine. Yeah. Georgian, on the other hand, we saw a Georgian pitch track that suggested that Georgian is a right prominent language. So that should mean, and something which is true about Georgian, that 39a is no good. Because in the string that contains C and who, there's also bread, and Georgian is right prominent, and so bread will be more prominent than who. And so you may not say 39a, you must say 39b. That's English and Georgian. English and French, sorry, that's Japanese and Georgian. English and French are the mirror images of Japanese and Georgian. So English is a left prominent language that's head initial. And so we ask ourselves, if you have a C and you have a phrase to the right of C, can there be other phrases between the C and the WH phrase? And the answer is no, the WH phrase must move to be adjacent to the C. If there are any phrases between C and the WH phrase, if you said, you saw who in English, well, you, because English is left prominent, you would be more prominent than who. And so who would be forced to move. Yeah. So it follows from the results of these experiments that English must move its WH phrases and that French need not, because French is right prominent. It can leave its WH phrases instantly. I'll skip over Pied Piping for reasons of time. Similar kind of fact. Let's talk about verb movement to T. So for verb movement to T, we're talking about probe goal contiguity between T and the subject and between little v and the object. We're assuming probe goal relations between those things. English we've seen as a left prominent language. French we've seen as a right prominent language. Yeah. So let's consider first English little v and French T. English little v, so consider 48a. So assume there's a little v somewhere inside C's. We're asking, can that little v be related to Mary across an intervening adverb? The answer is, well, no, English is a left prominent language, so there can't be an adverb there. That adverb would be more prominent than Mary. Yeah. And the same is true for French subject and T. So the French subject and T, French is a right prominent language. So French T and the verb can't be separated from the subject by an intervening adverb. So the data in 48 are related in this account to the fact that French allows WH in situ and that English does not, and to the results of the experiments that we just ran through. This is usually described as a condition on case assignment. We say, English accusative case can only be assigned under adjacency or something like that. We try to get that to be a result. In the account that I'm showing you here, it's not about accusative case versus nominative case. It's about probes that precede their goals versus probes that follow their goals. So English T in a left prominent language, it can be separated from the subject by an adverb because, well, John is to the left of often in 48a. So John will be more prominent than often. Often can separate John from T. If that's the right way of talking about it, if it's not a difference between nominative and accusative case, but a difference between probes that precede their goals and probes that follow their goals, then if we arrange for T to precede its goal in English, then we will see adjacency requirements again. And that is what we see. So if English T moves into C, like in a question, it needs to be adjacent to the following subject. There can be adverbs at the beginnings of sentences in English, things like probably Mary is happy, but you cannot do T to C across them. You cannot ask questions like, is probably Mary happy? This is out. And the star in 49b in this story is the same star as the star on often in 48a. It's a ban on adverbs that go between probes and goals that follow them. English objects can be separated from the verb, but not by phrases. So you can say she looked up the reference. That's fine, but not she looked right up the reference. Puzzle on classic stories. And again, for reasons of time, I'll hustle through the data about French infinitives. It also follows from from this account. So this is an account of a fact that is usually stated as the French verb raises to T, unlike the English verb. That's why the French verb can be separated from the object, unlike the English verb. The other thing you then say in French standardly is, oh, except in infinitives. Well, in this story, the French verb is being required to be adjacent to the subject. Because of this probe goal contiguity requirement, T needs to be adjacent to the subject. In an infinitive, the subject is null. And so that removes a restriction on where the French verb may go, which is what we expect. That's 51. That's English and French. It's also Norwegian and Icelandic. So if you look at V2 clauses, Norwegian is just like English. You can have adverbs between the subject and T. You can't have adverbs between the verb and the object. Icelandic is like French. It's the other way around. In this account, that's related to the fact that the facts that we saw in the experiment, we saw that Norwegian is a left prominent language and that Icelandic is a right prominent language. So everything follows. I'll also skip 33.4, which is about raising past experiencers. This is this brilliant work by Kenyon Brannon, who noticed we can use the account that we've established here to deal with a contrast that you see in 54 between languages like English and Norwegian, which allow you to do raising across experiencers, allow you to say things like Mary seems to John to be talented, as opposed to languages like French and Icelandic, which do not allow you to say that. So John seems to Mary to have talent. This is out in French and in Icelandic. Brennan's insight was, sure, we can account for that if we say the subject needs to be contiguous not only to obey this probe-goal contiguity relation, not only with the matrix T, but also with the embedded T, the T of the embedded clause. So in 54a, the T of the embedded clause, the 2 of the embedded clause, can satisfy probe-goal contiguity with Mary, across anything, because English is a left prominent language. Doesn't matter how many phrases there are between Mary and that embedded T. But in French and Icelandic, those are right prominent languages. So the fact that 54C and 54D is bad with the intervening experiencer is the same fact as the fact that you can't have an adverb between the subject and the T in those languages. So we can account for all of these facts as long as we're requiring the raised subject to be contiguous with both instances of T. As we also expect, this is also Brennan's point, problem for classic accounts of these facts, if you remove the experiencer, if you WH move it, or if you deprive it of its prosodic status by making it eclitic, you fix these examples in these languages. To whom did the horses seem to be slow is apparently perfectly good Icelandic, even though you can't raise across experiencers in Icelandic. And this follows in this account. So as long as the horses, once you've WH moved horses out of the way, who out of the way in 57, once you've WH moved who in 57, the horses are now contiguous with both the matrix T and the embedded T in Icelandic. You've gotten rid of the only phrase that was intervening between them. This was a problem for classic accounts. It looks sort of countercyclic. Sadly, I'm out of time right when I get to the section that's labeled counterexamples. Darn, too bad. I will just have to skip the counterexamples. You should feel free to ask me about the counterexamples if you must. One counterexample that some of you may be thinking of, I've shown you that Russian is a right prominent language. I've also shown you that right prominent languages ought to have the option of WH in situ. French, Portuguese, and Zulu are right prominent languages that do have the option of WH in situ, so that sounds pretty good. But Icelandic, Italian, Russian, and I said Italian again, that's not true, that's Bulgarian, do not have WH in situ. In fact, they have overt WH movement. I have a story about why that is. Feel free to ask me. I'll be glad to tell you. So let me just skip this part and get to the conclusions. What's the conclusion? I started out by telling you we have some syntactic parameters that are standardly assumed. Some languages move their WH phrases, some don't. Some raise the verb to T, others don't. The proposal I've been making is that this is the wrong way to think about things. At least for the kinds of phenomena I've been talking to you about here, it's possible that there aren't any syntactic parameters. What there are universal conditions on the prosodic consequences of probe-goal relations. Cross-linguistically invariant syntax, the same probes agreeing with the same goals, and some cross-linguistic variation, but the variation has to do with facts about phonology. The upshot of this is that if you know what the rules are for where prosodic prominence goes in your language, that tells you things about where things may move and where they must move, as long as we're willing to say that the syntax cares about where prosodic prominence goes. That's the basic idea. The upshot of it all is that if you are a child trying to acquire your native language, when your parents say things to you like, once upon a time, a little girl was walking through the forest, they are telling you, if they're speaking English, in our language, WH movement is obligatory, the verb does not raise to T, the conditions on piping are relatively strict, we skipped that, and it's okay to raise across experiencers. What that means is that you don't actually have to hear any of these syntactic structures in order to learn that about your language. You just have to know where prominence goes, which is something you learn about from every sentence you hear. That's the basic idea. And I will stop there. Thank you again for listening. I'm going to keep this share up just in case we need it during the question period.
Thank you, Norvin. I'm trying to get my camera to come back and join me. It's been interesting between me and my camera. I think I have some version of it.
I have the participants list in front of me, and so if people have questions, I will just call on them if that's all right.
That is totally fine.
Yep.
No, that's totally fine.
The drawback to that is that then I have to mispronounce people's names, and so I apologize for that in advance.
So be it.
Paulina, did you have a question?
Yeah, but I think Omer was the first one.
It's okay. You can go first.
No, go ahead, Paulina.
Yeah, thank you. But my question was just, so in some languages, WH movement is optional. So how would this account for the optionality of this such movement?
That is a really excellent question, and I am glad that you asked it. What it allows me to do is go more slowly through something that I went through too quickly just now. But where is this thing that I want to go through more slowly? It's not there. If you're thinking about a language like, say, French, in which WH phrases may remain in situ, but they don't have to. Is that the kind of language you're thinking about?
Well, I'm thinking about Hilmari, where they mostly remain in situ, but they actually can go to the left as well, if you really want.
Ah, cool. So you have much more exotic things on your mind than French. I would like to learn more about Hilmari. That would be awesome. I'm going to give up on finding the relevant place in the handout. If you consider what this theory requires of a head initial language that's right prominent, what it says is, if you have your initial C and you have your WH phrase that's staying, starts out in situ, and you're asking, is it okay for the WH phrase to remain in situ? The only requirement is that you set things up so that the smallest string that contains the C and the WH phrase has the WH phrase as its most prominent thing. So here, let me scribble on my handout. So here I am, I'm speaking French, or possibly I'm speaking Hilmari, and I've got a bunch of phrases between my WH phrase and my C, but I'm speaking a right prominent language, and what that means is that the WH phrase is the most prominent thing in this string. So this string is an acceptable string. This is the way of predicting that this is the kind of language in which WH phrases may remain in situ. And then we can ask ourselves, what would happen if you WH moved? So, now, well, here, we'll do it this way. That was, C with a bunch of following phrases. What would happen if you WH moved so that now your WH phrase is right next to your C? Is that also an acceptable string in a right prominent language? And the answer is yes. So the WH phrase and the C, they're right next to each other. There aren't any phrases between them that would interrupt probe goal contiguity. So both of these ought to be acceptable. And if we don't say anything else, if we don't say, oh, you should always stay in situ if you can, you should only move if you must, or you should always move if there's any reason to, if we don't say anything like that, then what we expect is that these will be languages in which you have both options. And that's what we seem to see. I just incautiously said that French and Hilmari are both examples of this. I know French is, and now somebody would have to find out, where prosodic prominence goes in Hilmari. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let's see, who else can I mispronounce? Omer.
Hey, hi. So in the spirit of not talking about the counterexamples, because there's no time, I'll ask you two questions, but you can choose which one to answer. I'll make it short.
Okay, cool.
One is, if your results are right, doesn't this show that there is a lot less probe goal going on than some of my syntax semantics colleagues / upward degree colleagues / people who think that binding is agreement colleagues suppose that there is? Second question, does the treatment of intervention and raising in Icelandic make a lot of the long distance agreement facts into a coincidence? Because you get a lot of the same facts with the nominative staying downstairs, and you can say, yeah, but you intervene in agreement. So it's clearly intimately related to probe goal stuff, except that all that intervention causes is that the thing can't agree. It can still appear.
Yes.
Those are my two questions.
So your second question is one that you and I have talked about before. And what I remember saying to you at the time was, yes, the facts are similar, but not the same. And as I remember, Brennan, who did a lot of thinking about this, convinced himself that, sure, it's okay to have a theory of one of these that doesn't extend to the other because there are differences. Sure would be nice to have a single theory of both of them, but it's not obvious that we're wrong to have a theory that only gets one of them because the facts are not identical. Your first question was about other kinds of probe-goal relations, and yes, if anybody thought that anaphore binding involved a probe-goal relation between the binder and the anaphore, where the binder was the probe and the anaphore was the goal, or even if they thought it was the other way around, I would have to hope that they were wrong. Yes, yes, that's right. They at least can't be this kind of probe-goal relation. Anybody else have questions? Oh, Paulina is back. Hello, Paulina.
I have another question, whether should we expect this theory to help us to understand the issues with pseudonoun incorporation or not? Because like it's also something where like full DPs can move and bare nouns have to remain in situ. And it's also with prosody. So should we expect some predictions?
I sure hope that it does, that we can get this to cover and some of these things. It's a really excellent question. Some of the theory in both uttering trees and in contiguity theory was inspired by work on pseudonoun incorporation in Niuean in particular. There's a very nice Harvard dissertation that I'm going to try to find a link to. No, I'm going to fail to find a link to it. What's going on? Oh, I see what's going on. I'm trying to annotate my handout at the same time that I'm trying to scroll in it. So there's a beautiful Harvard dissertation by Lauren Clemens, 2014, that was sort of the inspiration for some of this work. What I think in the end is that pseudonoun incorporation, I'm hoping it'll involve another kind of contiguity relation, which is between not only a probe and a goal where the goal is a phrase, but also between a probe and some heads that are in the goal, such that those heads need to satisfy probe-goal contiguity, as well as the entire phrase of the goal. And I want to try to relate that to the fact that those goals are, as you say, syntactically impoverished. They're missing some functional structure. So the short version of the answer is yes. Encourage you to go have a look at Lauren Clemens' dissertation, which is a nice starting point for that kind of idea.
Thank you.
John Balin says that he has a question, but he can't raise his hand because he's the host. That's so sad. Does anybody want to jump ahead of John Balin, or shall I call on John Balin?
Please do jump ahead of me, anybody. Yeah. I just want to know that my little real hand is up.
Got it. I can't see very many pictures. That's so I'm not ignoring anybody. If anybody has an actual hand, then feel free to use your electronic hand. Alexandra, yes.
Yeah. Hello. I actually have a question about right versus left branching. So you said that what you propose is a way to eliminate this parameter about WH in situ versus movement of WH movement. But yes. Then it seems that in each group you present, like in both groups, there are left and right branching languages. And yes. Does this stay as a parameter, or is it a kind of a sneaky way out of leaving it as a parameter?
That's a really good question. So when maybe one way to put it is when I started this talk, you had to believe both in languages that had that were left branching and languages that were right branching. That's one parameter. And you also had another parameter that had to do with whether WH phrases could stay in situ or not. And I have tried to eliminate the second parameter, but I haven't done anything about the first parameter. There's a really nice body of work, which I can't remember whether I cited Trace here. No, I didn't. It's by Hisao Tokizaki and his colleagues, in which he takes a stab at developing a phonological version of a head direction parameter. It's frustrating work in that he's clearly onto something, because what he says is true, statistically significantly true, but there are a zillion counterexamples, and it's difficult to figure out what to do next. I've been fooling with this for a little while, but what he says is, it turns out to be true to a statistically significant degree that you can predict whether a head will be initial or final by looking at what the rules are for where stress goes in that head. In languages where stress, if you study stress systems, there are various kinds of stress systems, but a popular kind anchors a count of syllables, either at the right edge or the left edge of words. So you get languages where stress is initial, or languages where stress is final, or where it's penultimate, right? There are languages where it's more complicated than that. But it's common for languages to have stress systems that say, start at the end of the word and count backwards n number of syllables, or start at the beginning of the word and count forward n number of syllables. And what Hisao shows, what Tokizaki shows, is that if you have a stress system in which you make reference to the left edges of words, you tend to be head final. And that if you have a stress system in which you make reference to the right edges of words, you tend to be head initial. Now, as I say, there are many counterexamples. If any of you have favorite languages that are counterexamples, you may be thinking of them right now. But if you, do large scale studies, if you look at walls and you look at, data from a large variety of languages, this is mostly true. And as I say, it's frustrating because it's often false. But that's a direction that I'm interested in going to try to answer your question. Alexandra, did I get close enough to answering your question to satisfy you for a while?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
sure.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. John, did you want to ask a question?
Thank you. I wanted to try to ask a question.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the first two sort of classic cases were verb raising to T. So this is sort of like a general concept of what, how the world is different in this world from the world that maybe isn't the standard world for some people.
Right.
It was verb raising to T, which French has and English doesn't classically, and then WH and C2 versus over WH movement. Yeah. So in the first case, there have been claims that how we know whether we have to raise to T, or what languages have V to T, has something to do with the complexity of the verbal paradigms, richness of agreement paradigms and stuff like that. So presumably, so my first question is kind of thing is that any sort of thinking like that should now be sort of abandoned and would be epiphenomenal or irrelevant or misleading or something like that? Or is there still room for things like that? That's a kind of one, but the larger one is, and in WH movement, there really wasn't a nice candidate for that. So that seems to be better for you than maybe, or not better for you, but less harder to swallow for someone joining your world.
Sure.
Yeah, but in the WH case, it's not a matter of either you do or either you don't. Of course, as you know better than anyone, there's the single WH movement, there's the multiple WH movement, and then there's the two kinds of multiple WH movement languages. So will all of those be, in other words, how far does this take us? And does it take us all the way so that, because it's a beautiful thing, if it can be, phonological information that will set all of this stuff for us and get all of this business. And then the tag on to that, and then I'll stop, is, does it mean that the syntax, so that English and French both have this rule of this raising available, the head raising available? It's as if you happen to do it in English over an adverb, you're going to get this violation. If you happen not to do it in French, you're going to get a problem, and so on. So that sort of, so the question there is, where does the ungrammaticality come in? Is it all on the sort of filter, sort of spell out level where we just wipe out, we can derive all this stuff, but then we wipe it out with the filter at the end? End of sort of unrelated sort of question.
That was lots of really good questions, and I'll probably forget some of them as I'm going through. So the first one was about whether the literature, which, as you say, is a classic literature that says the difference between English and French has to do with richness of phi agreement morphology on the verbs, and that, you know, if you have richer phi agreement morphology on the verbs, then you tend to raise the verbs, and otherwise you don't. And as you know, as anybody who's looked at that literature knows, it's a literature that's full of, you know, counterexamples and difficulties with defining exactly what we mean by richness. And it wasn't clear to me, at least, that there was a triumphant conclusion to that literature, although it could all be looked at. On the other hand, there was enough going on there for people to be excited about that idea for a long time. And so it would be a shame to just throw it all out. One possibility, which I have not explored, is that you know, that we should try to do something like that backwards. You know, so we'll say, no, really, what accounts for, you know, whether you are English or French is whether you are right prominent or left prominent. And what we're learning is that there's a general tendency for there to be richer phi agreement morphology when T is being constrained to be adjacent to the subject, right? And that's, you know, so that the explanation goes the other way, you know, that it's, if you act this way, then you tend to maybe kind of have richer phi agreement morphology. And then maybe we can feel better about the counterexamples because I got to use the word tend. It's not actually explaining the, it's not the engine of the explanation, but yes, no, it's a really, it's something that's worth thinking about, is whether there's any version of that that's worth salvaging. Another one of your questions was what I was going to say about, you know, languages that have multiple overt WH movement. And in fact, as you said, there are arguably more than one kind of multiple overt WH movement. That was one of the things that I skipped because it was a counterexample, and also because well, for various reasons. Okay, so I said, we've got all these right prominent languages. One of the reasons I did this study, both for Russian and Bulgarian, was that I wanted to see, you know, are those left prominent languages or right prominent languages? And they're right prominent languages, they just are. And so this theory makes it sound like they ought to have the option of leaving WH in situ. Same with Italian. Italian ought to have the option of WH in situ, and it doesn't. So 62 is bad in Italian. For Icelandic, I had a story in the Contiguity theory book, which I think still works, which says Icelandic is V2, and V2 languages generally don't allow WH in situ. And maybe we can appeal to something like multitasking. So the idea will be, here I am, I'm a C in Icelandic. I have the V2 property, and I'm also agreeing, let's imagine I'm an interrogative C, I'm also agreeing with a WH phrase. Why not satisfy all my needs at once, right? Move the WH phrase, thereby creating contiguity with the WH phrase and satisfying my V2 requirement. So that would be the idea, that Icelandic longs to be French. It's really French deep underneath, but it's also V2, and V2 is what gets in the way. That doesn't work for Italian or Russian and Bulgarian, which are not V2. The thing about Italian, Russian, and Bulgarian is that they don't have WH in situ anywhere. So we need to say something else about them anyway. I mean, they don't have WH in situ even in the places where languages like English do. So Italian doesn't allow multiple WH questions. At least older speakers of Italian don't allow multiple WH question. I've had younger speakers of Italian tell me that they kind of can, and I'm sort of curious about what exactly they're doing. And then Russian and Bulgarian, of course, move all of their WH phrases. This is not true of Icelandic. One of our students, Naomi Francis, had an idea about this for which I would love to find evidence. I don't have any, but her idea goes like this. All of the talk so far has been about how you find out where the language has prominence in fairly small phrases. You know, the tests all involve noun phrases, DPs, things that phonologists would call phonological phrases, phrases that are smaller than the entire clause. But people who work on prosody have another category that they apply to phonological phrases that correspond to entire clauses. They call those intonational phrases. And Naomi Francis's idea was, yeah, you have tests for where prominence goes in phonological phrases in these small domains, but maybe what we should be doing is developing other tests for where prominence goes in the clause. And maybe those would be the tests that would be relevant for WH questions. So the idea would be, yeah, Russian and Bulgarian and Italian, we've learned that they're right prominent languages in this smaller domain. But because we're looking at WH questions, we must also know what they do with intonational phrases. And the problem, and this is where the story winds down, because I don't have any tests to show you for what languages do with their intonational phrases. But the idea would be, yeah, maybe English doesn't have left prominence in its intonational phrases, but maybe Russian and Bulgarian do. And so although their WH phrases, as far as everything we've talked about, ought to be able to stay in situ, WH phrases, because they are being agreed with by C, they need to also be prominent in the intonational phrase. And that's what requires them all to move to the left. Lots of work to do to find any evidence for that, but I think it's a neat idea. I have a feeling I must have forgotten one of your questions because I feel like there were more than that. But if you want to remind me of what it was,
Sorry about that. No, it's just the sort of like subservience of syntax to phonology.
Oh, yeah.
Big picture thing.
So some of the stuff that I end up doing, there are cases of what looks like opacity. That is where the syntax does something and then it does something else. And just cases of cyclicity. Sorry, let me give you an example. Suppose we're speaking French and I choose to do overt WH movement and I do long distance WH movement. So I do WH movement out of an embedded clause into a higher clause. Right? Well, and suppose what I'm WH moving is a subject. So because it's a subject, I can't have any adverbs that would go between it and the verb. So like negation can't precede the verb. Even though later on, I'm going to move the WH phrase, into a higher clause. It's going to move up many different clauses. We end up with a picture where, everything that I've been telling you kind of has to be true within a given spell out domain. Maybe it has to be true in the embedded clause. So, when we're asking, should I put negation before or after the verb? The answer is I should put it after the verb, because we don't know at that point when we're doing the embedded clause that the WH phrase is going to move higher up. So there has to be at least that much derivational opacity going on, which makes me think that the syntax can't just be doing the syntactic thing and then we hand the results of syntax to the phonology and the phonology, does stuff later on. It has to be that the narrow syntax, the system that I'm imagining, is one in which the placement of prosodic prominence, at least, that much building of prosodic structure is happening during the narrow syntactic derivation. And the narrow syntax is sort of paying attention to that as it's deciding whether to move things and where to move them to. But that's sort of the $1 million question. The question you're asking is, as we work on this, can we find out whether we can, whether we need something like that, or whether we can make do with something like the classic system where the syntax does its thing and then the phonology messes with it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Polina, you were right. Russian was among the right prominent languages.
I was just answering in the chat. Like maybe
I see. Yeah. So there was a question about that. Yeah. No. So yes, and Tiazen wanted to know, why Russian moves its WH phrases, which I've now admitted that I sort of don't know why, although Naomi Francis has a nice idea about it. There's another hand. Whose hand is that? That is Paulina's hand. Hello, Paulina.
Can I just ask another question about the prominence? So you talked about the pitch, that the prominence is correlated with a higher pitch. But as a Russian speaker, I perceive that these are like very distinct parameters. So for example, I think, well, I have not done any studies on Russian intonation, but I perceive it as the most prominent word is within the clause is on the right. And what is important for me is that the pitch goes down. And not up. So But for example, the highest pitch on the topic phrase, that's why the subject to the left will be very high, is to the left.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what the correlation between like real prominence and high pitch is.
Yes, no, you're raising a really good question, to which I plan to devote lots of research to try to figure out the answer to your question. All I can tell you is that so one of the things that you just raised was the possible influence of information structure, so things like topic, and that's a whole can of worms that I'm attempting not to open. So as I'm showing people these sentences in these experiments, I'm asking people to read them out of the blue as though they are the beginnings of discourses. So I'm attempting to weed out the effects of information structure, of things like topic and focus. But ultimately, that's a kind of thing that we'll actually have to study more carefully than that. You're raising a very good point, though, and this is one of the classic results of phonological work. You know, the naive assumption was that when people first began studying pitch, the naive assumption was that stressed syllables are going to tend to have higher pitch, and of course it's much more complicated than that. So there are people who work on prosody. They posit these intonational tunes that sometimes associate low tones with the stressed syllable. That's absolutely right. The work that I did here, I was not looking necessarily at the stressed syllable itself. I was looking at where the highest pitch was in the word. I thought those highest pitches were associated with stressed syllables, but sometimes they weren't on the stressed syllables themselves. Sometimes they were later. But you're raising a good question. Are we ever going to find any cases where lowering a pitch, making a pitch lower than it would ordinarily be, contributes to some notion of prominence somewhere else? Like, so this discussion that I just offered you from Naomi Francis about differences between intonational phrase prominence and phonological phrase prominence, maybe that's the place that we will want to study that. So you're raising a lot of good open questions that we have to study the answers to.
Thank you. It was just the question. It was basically why do we assume that the pitch accent that we would mark the most prominent syllable would be H star and not L star, because this is how I perceived Russian.
No, I understand. Yeah. So and basically what I'm hoping is that there will tend to be, when there are L stars, there will be L star H's. You know, that there is an H somewhere that we're looking for. If we find places where all we have is an L star, then I'm hoping that those will be the result of special information structures, and then we're going to want to study those, try to understand those.
Any
things people would like to know about?
Questions? In that case, Norvin, if you send the handout over, we will post it for the students later on the website. And if you unshare your screen for a second, then we can have people say goodbye.
Let me do that.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so you have the talk handout there, and I will also post it more generally for everyone. Thank you. And let us warmly thank our speaker, Norvin. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure. Enjoy sunny St. Petersburg, everybody. I wish I were in that virtual space with you. And
it was great to have you. Thanks, everyone.
So long, everybody.
See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day.